In the remote, desolate hills of eastern Oregon, a truth has been buried beneath the dust of time and government records for more than a century. A truth so horrifying that local authorities swore to conceal it at all costs. Between 1852 and 1888, more than 800 pioneers vanished along a mere 20-mile stretch of the legendary Oregon Trail. They did not fall to disease, nor to the usual accidents of the harsh journey. Instead, they were claimed by something far darker, a killing machine wrapped in a cloak of holiness. At the center of this tragedy was the Sacred Heart Chapel, a modest wooden house that outwardly appeared to be a place of salvation for dying travelers, but in reality served as the lair of one of the most organized, large-scale, and ruthless chains of crime in frontier history. The early disappearances seemed like scattered accidents, but soon they evolved into a family trade, run coldly, systematically, redefining the very notion of evil. The Grayson family did not kill merely to rob. They elevated murder into an art, keeping meticulous records of each victim, each family erased, each dream buried beneath shallow graves on lonely hillsides. The Mask of Charity. In 1851, Father Mori Grayson built the Sacred Heart Chapel on a knoll overlooking a familiar resting point for travelers. Outwardly, it was a simple place of worship, a crude wooden cross, patched benches, and a small cemetery beside it. But what raised suspicion was the unusually large cellar beneath the chapel, which Grayson excused as a storage space to help the needy. Alongside Mori was Sister Constance, his gentle wife with rudimentary medical knowledge, who often called herself the nun who heals with God's herbs. And Brother Ezekiel, his skilled craftsman brother, who always appeared at the right time when a family needed help with their wagon or livestock. Together, the trio created a perfect illusion of Christian charity. They knew that families arriving here were exhausted, desperate from sickness, loss, and hunger. They offered spiritual comfort, medicine, and temporary shelter, while in reality, it was a deadly trap. The first victim. On September 23, 1852, the Morrison family became the first prey of the tragedy. James Morrison, his pregnant wife Elizabeth, their 3 small children, and his elderly father Samuel, after breaking away from their caravan, happened to break a wagon axle near the chapel. To them, the sight of the Sacred Heart Chapel on the hilltop seemed nothing less than a blessing from heaven. Ezekiel appeared, his deep voice slow and honeyed. "Brother, God has brought you here for a reason. Your wife is about to give birth. Father Mori will give you shelter, and Sister Constance has delivered many babies. Let us serve you." The Morrisons suspected nothing. They stayed in a wooden shack beside the chapel. For the first 3 days, life seemed peaceful. The children played in the yard. James got help fixing the wagon, Elizabeth was cared for, and Samuel rested in a comfortable wooden chair. But on the 4th day, shadows began to fall. The old man Samuel suddenly fell ill, racked with stomach pain, vomiting, and violent diarrhea. Sister Constance dismissed it as trail fever and brought her holy medicine made from herbs kept in the cellar. "God purifies the body by letting it expel poison," she whispered as she spooned the potion into his mouth. But the sacred remedy was in fact a death sentence. Samuel's skin turned pale, his breath faltered, and his eyes grew dim before closing forever. This was only the beginning of a nightmare that would stretch for over 3 decades, where prayers, hymns, and the shadow of the cross served only as a curtain to hide a calculated massacre dragging countless souls to the grave. James Morrison, at first only bewildered at how quickly his father was wasting away, once pleaded with Father Mori, "Perhaps we should find someone at the Eastern Trading Post. Maybe they'll have medicine or a doctor." But Mori only placed his bony hand on James's shoulder, his voice heavy with the stench of sermonizing. "My brother, do not be hasty. I have witnessed this illness many times on the trail. If we move Samuel now, he will surely die along the way. I believe the Lord has brought you here, and only through patience shall we see his mercy." Those words, cloaked in the solemnity of a shepherd, smothered the last flicker of doubt. James, like so many faithful souls desperate to cling to belief, bowed his head in resignation. On the 6th day, tragedy struck again. 7-year-old Tommy was seized with fever, trembling with the same symptoms. Soon after, little Mary, only 5, collapsed as well. Sister Constance, with gentle hands and eyes overflowing with false compassion, prepared more of her holy medicine, murmuring prayers as she spooned the concoction to the children's lips. To James and Elizabeth, still healthy but broken from sleepless nights at their loved ones' bedsides, Constance was an angel in gray cloth, a nun sacrificing herself for others. But behind the mask was a terrible truth. In every cup, every sip of tea lay carefully measured doses of arsenic. Arsenic, that silent white powder Grayson had cleverly procured from the mines, claiming it was for killing rats that spoiled the harvest. They knew that on a trail rife with disease, stomach cramps, pale skin, faltering breath, and decaying organs could easily be written off as trail fever or dysentery. No one suspected the hand of man. On the 7th day, Samuel drew his last breath. On the 9th, Tommy followed his grandfather into the cold grave. By the 11th day, Mary, her once wide, bright eyes now turned to milky orbs, was laid beneath the earth of the chapel's cemetery. Each death was cloaked in ritual pomp, scripture-laden sermons, feigned tears, hymns echoing through wooden walls. Morai spoke of the eternal house in heaven, of a family reunited in glory, and James and Elizabeth, hearts shattered, clung even tighter to the illusion that Grayson was their savior, not their executioner. The invisible hand of Ezekiel. While they wept and prayed, brother Ezekiel, silent as a hound, rummaged through their chests and trunks. He catalogued everything. The gold coins stitched into James's coat, the fine Missouri-crafted furniture, each piece of jewelry, each rare blacksmith's tool of the frontier. Everything was tallied, lives included. On the 12th day, James, the family's pillar, began coughing violently, his face ashen. Elizabeth, heavy with child, clutched Constance's arm in desperation, trembling as she begged, "Please, save my husband. Please, don't let me lose him too." The nun, her gaze dripping with false pity, whispered words that would later haunt the investigation records. "My dear child, there are illnesses not meant to be cured but to call souls back to God. Accept his divine will. You will raise your child with the faith that your family smiles upon you from heaven." James died on the 14th day, only hours before Elizabeth's agonizing labor brought forth a son. The infant, frail and weak, lived but a few hours, long enough only to receive baptism from Morai's hand, before slipping away. 3 days later, Elizabeth, her strength gone, her spirit broken, collapsed, sealing the Morrison family's annihilation in just 19 days. Crime rationalized to the outside world, Grayson crafted the perfect tale. The Morrison family arrived already ill, struck down by a violent dysentery outbreak. Father Morai had prayed tirelessly and buried them with Christian rites. Their possessions, donated to God's work, were nothing more than a sanctified euphemism for plunder. No one questioned it. On the Oregon Trail, whole families perishing from disease was nothing unusual. Thousands of nameless wooden crosses lined the path, whispering of deaths no one could explain. The Morrisons became just another forgotten name in the sea of the dead. Blood lessons for a murderous trade. The first case gave the Graysons their golden lessons. Lone families were the ripest prey. Arsenic was the perfect accomplice, masked as natural sickness. Religious authority was an unbreakable shield, transforming murderers into spiritual fathers. And the Oregon Trail, with its endless caravans, was an inexhaustible goldmine of lives. Victims who vanished without question for months, even years. During the winter of 1852 to 1853, when the trail lay quiet, the Graysons made their calculations. The chapel cellar was expanded. One area for stolen goods, another for poison mixing, another as a temporary morgue for bodies. Beyond the woods, shallow unmarked graves were dug, waiting for the next souls. Ezekiel became a cunning black market dealer, selling off valuables no one dared ask the origin of. Constance refined her dosages, hiding poison in sacramental wine, herbal teas, even the holy bread. And Morai honed his art of manipulation, knowing exactly what to say to Baptists, what to preach to Presbyterians, how to pray for Methodists. Everything was in place, and from the following spring, the Oregon Trail would no longer be just a road of hope. It would become a road of blood, where wagon after wagon vanished, never reaching the promised West. Spring 1853. When evil became a profession. After the Morrison case, the Graysons realized that to sustain their enterprise, murder alone was not enough. They needed planning, a discreet way to dispose of the loot, and most importantly, a solid facade. Brother Ezekiel quickly became the invisible merchant. He learned to distribute stolen goods by customer type, fine furniture to wealthy families in growing towns, farming tools and smithing equipment to hard-working settlers, jewelry and gold passed on to professional traders. Ezekiel even spaced out sales, never flooding one place with too much merchandise to avoid suspicion. By the spring of 1853, the Graysons were no longer clumsy killers. They had transformed into professional predators, masters of hunting, killing, concealing, and profiting. They had solved 4 crucial problems: how to choose victims, how to kill, how to dispose of bodies, and how to convert assets into gain. And they had built a saintly image so convincing that any accusation would seem absurd. The Hoffman family, a new experiment. In May 1853, fate brought the Hoffman family to the chapel's door, German immigrants with a heavily laden wagon full of valuables. Heinrich Hoffman, a skilled watchmaker, carried delicate tools and goods to open a shop in Oregon. With him were his pregnant wife Greta and their 3 young children. The Hoffmans were the perfect prey. Wealthy, carrying gold and treasures, isolated by language barriers, unable to easily cry for help. Their broken English made it harder to raise suspicion or seek aid from outsiders. Unlike with the Morrisons, this time the Graysons changed their strategy. Constance didn't wait for natural illness. She immediately gave the entire family preventive medicine, a supposed tonic against cholera on the trail. In truth, it was a carefully measured dose of arsenic, small enough to gradually weaken but not kill outright. "God bless you," Heinrich said in broken English, tears welling as he took the cup from Constance's hand. "The Lord has blessed us," she smiled, thin lips closing with chilling secrecy, "by giving us the chance to serve His children." The Hoffmans' deaths did not come suddenly but stretched out over nearly a month, and that was exactly what the Graysons wanted. Enough time to inventory each item, plan how to sell watchmaking tools, and experiment with building longer-lasting trust. Pages of blood. By the end of 1853, the Graysons had eradicated 3 entire families, 16 souls, and now viewed the process not as mere killing but as an industry with ledgers, reports, and cold analysis. In the chapel cellar, leather-bound notebooks were hidden away. Father Morai's handwriting was steady, neat, and chillingly bureaucratic like an accountant. Morrison family, 5 souls. September-October 1852. Assets, 2 gold coins, furniture, smithing tools. Bodies buried in forest. Plot C. Estimated profit $400. Method: arsenic in herbal tea. Notes: reduce dosage to prolong process. Avoid suspicion. Those words, unearthed years later, sent shivers through history. Human lives reduced to inventory, listed like stock, profit, and loss carefully calculated. The Weatherby family. A new challenge. The summer of 1854 marked a turning point. The Weatherbys, from Tennessee, were unlike any victims before. Charles Weatherby, a former Southern officer, carried the instincts of a seasoned soldier. With him were his wife Margaret, their twin daughters Sarah and Susan, aged 15, and his brother-in-law David, a skilled blacksmith. Their wagon was loaded with tools and hidden gold. When their wagon wheel broke near the chapel, Charles was wary. "Thank you for your kindness, but we have the skills to handle this. We'll be on our way." Morai, ever the manipulator, didn't argue. He shrugged lightly. "Very wise, brother. But I must warn you, the sickness spreads in this area. Even the smallest fever could be the start. Leaving now might doom your family." The suggestion of disease planted a seed of doubt. Margaret, sensitive and protective, began to waver. When David fell mildly feverish the next day, Constance immediately declared it an early symptom. The Weatherbys reluctantly stayed. What made this case unique was that the Weatherbys were not easily deceived. Charles scrutinized every gesture, asked for proof, pressed for answers. The Graysons countered with elaborate lies. Graves in the cemetery presented as victims of disease. Forged letters of gratitude shown as testimonies of those who had been healed. Morai pressed further, preying on Charles's pride. "If we meant you harm, we would have acted already. A former officer, armed and vigilant, you are the hardest target, but we choose to serve, for it is God's will." Charles, though cautious, began to relax. Death drawn out for 6 weeks. This became the longest killing the Graysons ever orchestrated. Constance began with minute doses of arsenic in sanctified water. Symptoms appeared slowly, indistinguishable from natural illness. David, the frailest, fell first. His death deepened Margaret's trust in Constance, believing only she could save them. Soon Margaret herself weakened. Each day the poison increased, while Morai preached endlessly about God's trials and the glory of heaven. 6 weeks later, with Sarah and Susan's cries echoing in the dark wooden chamber, the Weatherbys marched inevitably toward death. The inescapable snare the Graysons had so carefully laid. Charles's suspicion. Charles Weatherby, a former officer trained to read battlefields, began to sense something was terribly wrong. He noticed a strange pattern. He and his 2 daughters remained healthy, while Margaret and her brother David weakened in turn. The stomach cramps, the ashen skin, the labored breaths. Each episode followed shortly after the family drank Constance's medicine. And above all, every time the illness grew worse, the Graysons appeared exactly on cue with prayers, remedies, and comfort. The peak of his suspicion came one midnight, when Charles secretly checked the wagon and caught Ezekiel rummaging through their belongings. Confronted, Ezekiel stammered, "I was only checking for wild animals, friend." "Nobody wants to lose their goods out here." The excuse sounded plausible, but Charles's soldier's instinct screamed of something far darker. The next morning, beside his wife's sickbed, Charles whispered, "Margaret, we must leave this place. Something is wrong. I don't trust them anymore." But Margaret only shook her head weakly, her eyes dull. She was far too exhausted to go anywhere. Charles was trapped. To flee was to abandon his wife to die on the trail, but to stay meant risking the destruction of his entire family. The secret beneath the chapel. Determined to find proof, Charles crept into the chapel cellar. Behind a wooden wall, he uncovered a hidden compartment containing objects that could never have belonged to the Graysons. A child's doll, still fresh with fabric hands stained from recent play. A pocket watch engraved with an unfamiliar name. No one would discard such a keepsake. A half-written letter addressed to Oregon City in a woman's hand, overflowing with gratitude to the Christian family who cared for the sick children. Those words were a death sentence for the Graysons and a prophecy for the Weatherbees. Charles understood. He had stumbled upon evidence of serial murder and that he and his family were being poisoned day by day. But it was too late. That night, Margaret drew her last breath. The next morning, Charles awoke nauseous, racked with cramps, the very symptoms he had watched in his wife and brother-in-law. He did not know that Morai, sensing his suspicion, had secretly increased the poison in his supper, bringing his body to swift collapse. On his deathbed, gasping, Charles tried to warn his daughters. "Sarah, Susan, listen to me. They are not men of God." But his words slurred into delirium, mistaken by the twins as the ravings of a dying man. Sarah and Susan still trusted Constance, who sat beside them, whispering prayers, her hands clasped to theirs like the hands of an angel. The Graysons' lesson in blood. The Weatherby case taught the Graysons much. They learned how to deal with clever, cautious victims. That patience and psychological skill could break even the most seasoned minds. They also realized that drawing out the process made the epidemic story more believable and far more profitable. Time enough to catalog goods, liquidate assets, and preserve their mask of charity. Afterward, the Graysons began burning or burying items that could identify victims, melting jewelry to erase traces, and constructing more elaborate hidden chambers. The chapel evolved into an industrial killing machine, efficient, seamless, without cracks. By the end of 1854, the toll stood at 23 victims across 7 families. The Graysons no longer saw themselves as thieves or murderers, but deluded themselves into believing they were instruments of God, the stolen wealth a divine reward for their purification mission. 1855. The first hint of failure. But no crime remains perfect forever. In 1855, the Graysons faced their greatest challenge yet: a survivor. It began innocently enough with the arrival of the Patterson family from Ohio. Thomas Patterson, a prosperous merchant, traveled with his wife Emily, their 4 children, and Emily's younger sister Catherine. Unlike previous victims, the Pattersons were not only wealthy but also socially connected. If they vanished, people would ask questions. Ezekiel, the seasoned predator, approached swiftly. "Your livestock looks strong, friend," he said warmly. "Our chapel is nearby. You could trade for some fresh goods." Thomas, sharp-minded as any merchant, felt the weight of Ezekiel's over-eagerness. He replied coldly, "Thanks, but we have enough supplies to continue." Ezekiel smiled, patient. He knew how to plant fear. "Well, but lately there's been mountain fever. Folks fall ill slowly, and by the time they realize it, they're too weak to travel. Only Sister Constance has the remedy." The words struck home. Emily, ever the anxious mother, worried for her children. Thomas. What if the children catch it? In the end, Thomas agreed to stop by the chapel, only for a check before moving on. Little did they know that decision marked the beginning of the longest nightmare of their lives. Catherine, the one who saw through the holy mask. "Brother Ezekiel always inventories the traveler's belongings," Sister Constance explained when Catherine questioned her. "We've been robbed before. This is only to make sure nothing goes missing while a family is under our care." The excuse sounded reasonable, but it couldn't smother the growing suspicion in Catherine's heart. She began to notice every detail. The gleam of greed in Morai's eyes lingering too long on Thomas's gold watch. The way Constance always prepared medicine alone, never allowing anyone to see. And above all, the coincidence that whoever drank her mixtures grew gravely ill. forced to consume even more of it. Suspicion turned to horror on the fourth day when Catherine unexpectedly caught Constance mixing a white powder into Timothy's dose, the youngest child's. When confronted, Constance flinched but quickly smiled sweetly. This is holy salt to strengthen the medicine's effect. But Catherine was not easily fooled. Her father had been a pharmacist in Ohio, and her eyes recognized the substance instantly. This was no salt. More than that, the fleeting panic on Constance's face revealed everything. That night, Catherine made her fateful decision. She quietly spit every drop of the medicine into a handkerchief, then whispered to Timothy that it was a secret game. The boy, innocent and trusting, obeyed. The result was devastating. While Thomas, Emily, and the older children wasted away, Catherine and Timothy remained healthy. The mask of charity was slipping, and she had glimpsed the true face of their supposed saviors. Whispers in the night, by the sixth day, 2 of the Patterson children were dead. Thomas lay dying. Emily, weak but lucid, gazed at her sister with tear-filled eyes. Catherine bent close and whispered, "Emily, I think they're poisoning us. They are not our benefactors, they are murderers." At first, Emily reacted with anger. How could she accuse those who had prayed at their bedsides, cared for their family? But as Catherine pieced together every sign, the greedy stares, the white powder, the deadly coincidences, Emily began to grasp the terrible truth. "What do we do?" Emily breathed, desperate. "Leave," Catherine answered, eyes blazing. "If we stay, we die. I must take you and Timothy, even if it means leaving the others behind." It was a decision that broke her heart. But Catherine knew there was no other choice. The escape in darkness. Before dawn, when the chapel lay silent, Catherine led Emily and Timothy away from the hut. Thomas was too weak, the older children already unconscious. Catherine choked back sobs, but she knew. Staying meant dying with them. 3 trembling figures crept toward the wagon where Catherine had hidden a little food and gold. Just as they prepared to leave, footsteps echoed from the chapel. Father Morai. "Oh God," Catherine whispered. "Hide, not a sound." She stepped in front of the wagon. Morai approached, his cold eyes glinting in the night. Gone was the gentle facade. His voice was steady, chilling. "Sister, you should rest. Mountain fever breeds delusions. You're no longer in your right mind." Catherine's tone was calm. "I worry for Thomas and the children. I cannot sleep." Morai nodded slowly, eyes probing her soul. "Perhaps. Sister Constance will prepare a stronger medicine for you, one that will give you eternal rest." His hand moved under his cloak. Catherine knew. The moment had come. A gunshot. In the night before Morai could act, a weak voice came from behind the wagon. "Take your hand off my sister." Emily, frail, trembling from poison, stood there with Thomas's pistol. Her face pale, her hands shaking, but her eyes burned with resolve. Morai turned, momentarily stunned. In that instant, Catherine swung a heavy iron bar from the wagon, smashing it against his temple. The clang of metal on bone rang out. Morai staggered, fell, blood seeping, not dead but stunned, motionless for a precious second. "Go!" Catherine screamed. The wagon wheels screeched, tearing away from the chapel. Behind them, Ezekiel's furious shout split the night as he burst from the chapel, rushing toward the hut where the dying children lay. Catherine knew in that moment Ezekiel would finish what poison had begun. Flight into desperation. The next 3 days were a nightmare. Emily drifted in and out of consciousness, whispering her husband's and children's names. Catherine held the reins alone, eyes locked on the road, soothing Timothy, clutching his rag doll in terror, while praying they wouldn't be pursued. They wandered like the blind, clinging only to the need to flee the chapel of death. On the 4th day, when hope was nearly gone, they stumbled upon a patrol from Fort Dalles. At first, the commander thought Catherine insane with grief. A tale of a priest who poisons, a nun who kills sounded far too absurd. But Catherine had more than words. She carried evidence. Constance's medicine vial, flecks of the white powder, and the broken but lucid testimony of Emily, a mother dying slowly of arsenic. The soldiers fell silent, exchanging grave looks. Catherine knew. This was only the beginning of a horror the world had never heard before, the investigation and horrific discovery. When the soldiers entered Sacred Heart Chapel, the sight before them froze their blood. Thomas Patterson and his 3 older children lay dead, their bodies bearing unmistakable signs of arsenic poisoning. Purpled lips, ashen skin, shriveled organs. Beneath the chapel, the cellar revealed a truth few dared to believe, a stockpile of stolen goods arranged like a commercial warehouse, chests, sacks, and crates filled with the belongings of families who had vanished without a trace. But most chilling of all were the ledgers. Father Marai's handwriting was neat, precise, each page a death sentence written with the cold detachment of a bookkeeper. Victims' names, numbers, seized assets, methods of killing, and even lessons learned, written like business reports. Patterson was merely victim number 37. In less than 3 years, the Graysons had slaughtered over 150 people. Catherine's testimony, the sole survivor, together with the evidence she carried, became the keystone. For the first time, the Oregon territorial authorities and the federal government had to confront the truth. Beneath the robes of piety was a family that had turned murder into an industry of blood. The haunted survivors. Emily Patterson, her body ravaged by poison, never recovered. Less than a year after the escape, she collapsed, carrying to her grave the permanent wounds of body and soul. Timothy, the youngest, survived but was haunted for life, dreaming each night of the chapel and scripture whispered like knives cutting into his heart. He grew into a man consumed with hatred of religion, never again trusting a priest or a sacrament. And Catherine, the courageous sister, became an immortal witness. She told the story again and again before soldiers, officials, and federal judges. Through her testimony, investigators finally grasped the entire mechanism: how victims were chosen, how they were poisoned, how stolen goods were distributed. Catherine became the thorn that ensured the Graysons would never rest easy. The Graysons in flight. But demons are not easily chained. By the time soldiers reached the chapel, the Graysons had vanished. They took with them most of their gold, enough to restart their death enterprise elsewhere. With their skill in concealing tracks, knowledge of the trails, and a treasury of wealth, they slipped away like phantoms, leaving behind only a chapel drenched in blood. The manhunt officially began in the autumn of 1855, led by U.S. Deputy Marshal William Hriss, a man seasoned against bandits but never against predators like these. He wrote in his report, "These are not killers driven by rage. These are organized predators who have turned murder into a business. They understand human psychology, exploiting faith and compassion to set their traps. And they have both the intelligence and resources to rise again anywhere." For the next 2 years, the Graysons shed identities like snakeskin. In one town, they became moral merchants. Elsewhere, a missionary family, always cloaked in piety, always armed with carefully rehearsed stories. A new trail, the mission of mercy. In the spring of 1857, word from California reignited the hunt. Near the Oregon-California border, a new mission station appeared, calling itself the Mission of Divine Mercy. Here, a man named Father Benedict Morrison, alongside Sister Mary Morrison and Brother Thomas Morrison, welcomed weary travelers with open arms. The name Morrison, was it coincidence or a deliberate theft from their very first victims? No one knew. But Deputy Marshal Hriss immediately recognized the pattern. The station's location was too strategic, precisely where exhausted caravans would stop. Soon whispers began. Wealthy families who stopped there vanished. From afar, investigators observed, and what they saw was exactly what Catherine had once described: a larger wooden house, deeper cellars, rows of outbuildings. The killing machine had been rebuilt, more elaborate, more efficient, after their defeat in Oregon. The investigation and horrific discovery. When the soldiers entered Sacred Heart Chapel, the sight before them froze their blood. Thomas Patterson and his 3 older children lay dead, their bodies bearing unmistakable signs of arsenic poisoning. Purpled lips, ashen skin, shriveled organs. Beneath the chapel, the cellar revealed a truth few dared to believe: a stockpile of stolen goods arranged like a commercial warehouse, chests, sacks, and crates filled with the belongings of families who had vanished without a trace. But most chilling of all were the ledgers. Father Marai's handwriting was neat, precise, each page a death sentence written with the cold detachment of a bookkeeper. Victims' names, numbers, seized assets, methods of killing, and even lessons learned, written like business reports. Patterson was merely victim number 37. In less than 3 years, the Graysons had slaughtered over 150 people. Catherine's testimony, the sole survivor, together with the evidence she carried, became the keystone. For the first time, the Oregon territorial authorities and the federal government had to confront the truth. Beneath the robes of piety was a family that had turned murder into an industry of blood. The haunted survivors, Emily Patterson, her body ravaged by poison, never recovered. Less than a year after the escape, she collapsed, carrying to her grave the permanent wounds of body and soul. Timothy, the youngest, survived but was haunted for life, dreaming each night of the chapel and scripture whispered like knives cutting into his heart. He grew into a man consumed with hatred of religion, never again trusting a priest or a sacrament. And Catherine, the courageous sister, became an immortal witness. She told the story again and again before soldiers, officials, and federal judges. Through her testimony, investigators finally grasped the entire mechanism: how victims were chosen, how they were poisoned, how stolen goods were distributed. Catherine became the thorn that ensured the Graysons would never rest easy. The Graysons in flight. But demons are not easily chained. By the time soldiers reached the chapel, the Graysons had vanished. They took with them most of their gold, enough to restart their death enterprise elsewhere. With their skill in concealing tracks, knowledge of the trails, and a treasury of wealth, they slipped away like phantoms, leaving behind only a chapel drenched in blood. The manhunt officially began in the autumn of 1855, led by U.S. Deputy Marshal William Riss, a man seasoned against bandits but never against predators like these. He wrote in his report, "These are not killers driven by rage. These are organized predators who have turned murder into a business. They understand human psychology, exploiting faith and compassion to set their traps. And they have both the intelligence and resources to rise again, anywhere." For the next 2 years, the Graysons shed identities like snakeskin. In one town, they became moral merchants. Elsewhere, a missionary family, always cloaked in piety, always armed with carefully rehearsed stories. A new trail, the mission of mercy. In the spring of 1857, word from California reignited the hunt. Near the Oregon-California border, a new mission station appeared, calling itself the Mission of Divine Mercy. Here, a man named Father Benedict Morrison, alongside Sister Mary Morrison and Brother Thomas Morrison, welcomed weary travelers with open arms. The name Morrison, was it coincidence or a deliberate theft from their very first victims? No one knew, but Deputy Marshal Riss immediately recognized the pattern. The station's location was too strategic, precisely where exhausted caravans would stop. Soon, whispers began. Wealthy families who stopped there vanished. From afar, investigators observed, and what they saw was exactly what Catherine had once described. A larger wooden house, deeper cellars, rows of outbuildings. The killing machine had been rebuilt, more elaborate, more efficient, after their defeat in Oregon. The Dawn Raid. On June 15, 1857, before the sun had risen, Marshal Hriss whispered the order, "Move in." Federal agents and soldiers closed in on the mission of divine mercy from 3 directions. Boots pounded over dew-soaked earth, rifles at the ready, the noose tightening. This time there would be no escape for the Graysons. Inside, the wooden room still scented faintly of incense. The truth was peeled back layer by layer. A vast cellar brimmed with belongings from at least 20 families, silver chests, jewelry and everyday objects, children's dolls, family portraits, half-written letters never sent. Each item was a whisper from the past, a trace of lives erased. Worst of all were the thick leather-bound ledgers. In them, Marai, now calling himself Father Benedict, had recorded with meticulous precision, no different from a merchant's books. Family name, date of arrival, date of departure, method of execution, assets seized and estimated profit, lessons learned. Reading them was suffocating, a human life reduced to an inventory figure. An entire family erased like a closed transaction. The killing machine across states. The cellar's secrets revealed a horrifying truth. The Graysons had not confined their crimes to Oregon. They had operated across multiple territories since as early as 1845. Whenever suspicion drew near, they erased their trail, moved to a new region, erected another mission station, and began the cycle of blood anew. The earliest journal entries showed Amorai still conflicted, justifying to himself that helping the wretched escape their suffering was an act of mercy. But as the years passed, the language grew colder. No more God, no more excuses, only efficiency, cost optimization, risk reduction. Murder was written out like a production process, a death enterprise perfected step by step. Most terrifying of all, the final pages revealed plans for expansion. Multiple killing centers operating at once, each overseen by a family member, even calculations for exterminating larger groups instead of individual families. A vision so chilling that investigators were forced to admit. The Graysons no longer saw themselves as human, but as a corporation of murder. The Henderson family. Living witnesses. By fortune, the raid came while the Henderson family was still in the early stages of poisoning. Their youngest son, who had just fallen ill after drinking milk laced with the drug, was rescued in time. For the first time, authorities had living witnesses to describe the manipulation in detail. James Henderson, face etched with grief, recounted with trembling voice. They looked like angels. Father Benedict spoke so gently with such authority. And Sister Mary, God, she cared for the children like a mother, medicine, prayers, and everything seemed perfect. I truly believed God had sent them to us, but in truth they were killing my family day by day. His testimony, combined with the damning ledgers and the macabre cellar, carved into American history one of its most horrifying cases. A family that turned religion into a weapon, faith into a dagger, and a chapel into a slaughterhouse. Father Benedict spoke with such authority about Scripture and God's will. If someone had told me they were murderers, I would have called them crazy. The psychological manipulation techniques that the Graysons employed were sophisticated enough to deceive intelligent, educated people who had been specifically warned about the dangers of trusting strangers on the trail. Their religious authority, combined with their apparent medical knowledge and genuine charitable actions, created a facade that was nearly impossible to penetrate until it was too late. Sister Constance, when finally questioned by authorities, showed no remorse for her role in the murders. Instead, she expressed anger at being prevented from completing her medical treatments and insisted that the families they had killed were better off dead than continuing to suffer from trail diseases. Those people were dying anyway, she told Marshal Hendricks during her interrogation. We gave them comfort in their final days and ensured that their possessions went to support God's work rather than being wasted. We provided mercy that they wouldn't have received otherwise. Brother Ezekiel maintained his silence throughout the interrogation process, refusing to provide any information about their activities or express any opinion about their crimes. His behavior suggested that he viewed himself as a faithful follower who had simply obeyed orders without questioning their moral implications. Father Morai, however, displayed a completely different personality when confronted with evidence of his crimes. The charming, authoritative preacher disappeared, replaced by a cold, calculating killer who showed no emotion when presented with testimony from survivors or evidence of his victims' suffering. "You people don't understand what we accomplished," he told investigators. "We eliminated the weak and the diseased. We redistributed wealth from those who couldn't protect it to those who could use it effectively. And we provided spiritual comfort to people who would have died horrible deaths anyway. We were instruments of natural selection and divine will." The scope of the Graysons' crimes continued to expand as investigators analyzed their records and connected them to unsolved disappearances throughout the Western Territories. Families that had vanished without explanation, isolated graves discovered by later travelers, and reports of mysterious illnesses at remote religious sites all began to form a pattern that pointed to the Graysons' involvement. By the time the investigation was complete, authorities had connected the family to the murders of more than 800 people across multiple states and territories. The actual number was likely higher as many of their victims had been transient families whose disappearances had never been officially reported or investigated. The trial of the Grayson family began in September 1857 and quickly became one of the most sensational criminal proceedings in American frontier history. The prosecution, led by Territorial Attorney General Samuel Morrison, faced the challenge of presenting evidence of crimes that had been carefully concealed and victims who were no longer alive to testify. The key to the prosecution's case was the meticulous records that Father Morai had kept throughout their criminal career. These journals provided detailed accounts of individual murders, methods used, possessions stolen, and profits realized. Written in Morai's own handwriting, and containing information that only the perpetrators could have known, the records served as confessions that could not be disputed or explained away. Catherine Patterson's testimony provided crucial context for understanding how the murders were carried out and how the family had been able to deceive their victims so effectively. Her survival story demonstrated both the systematic nature of the Graysons' methods and the psychological manipulation techniques they employed to maintain control over their victims. The Henderson family's testimony showed that the Graysons had continued and refined their murderous activities even after their escape from the Sacred Heart Chapel. Their account of the attempted murders at the Mission of Divine Mercy proved that the family had learned from their previous mistakes and had developed even more efficient methods for killing entire families quickly. Perhaps most damaging to the defense was the physical evidence found at both the Sacred Heart Chapel and the Mission of Divine Mercy. Investigators had discovered not just possessions from murdered families, but also the tools and supplies used in the poisoning process, detailed maps showing the locations of unmarked graves, and correspondence with black market dealers who had purchased stolen goods. The defense attorneys attempted to argue that the family had been providing legitimate medical care to sick travelers, and that the deaths had been caused by diseases contracted during trail travel rather than deliberate poisoning. They suggested that the possession of other families' belongings could be explained by legitimate purchases or inheritance from grateful patients who had died despite their care. But the prosecution was able to demonstrate that the patterns of death at locations operated by the Grayson were statistically impossible, unless deliberate murder was involved. Expert medical testimony confirmed that the symptoms described by survivors were consistent with arsenic poisoning rather than natural trail diseases. Most importantly, the family's own records clearly described their activities as murder committed for profit rather than medical treatment provided for charitable purposes. The trial lasted 6 weeks and attracted national attention as newspapers across the country reported on the systematic murder of trail families by people posing as Christian missionaries. The case highlighted the vulnerability of westward migrants and the ease with which predators could exploit the trust and desperation of families seeking help in isolated areas. Father Murray Grayson was convicted on charges of multiple murder and sentenced to death by hanging. Sister Constance Grayson was also convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment, making her one of the first women in American frontier history to receive such a severe sentence for criminal activity. Brother Ezekiel Grayson was convicted as an accessory to murder and sentenced to 20 years in territorial prison. The executions and imprisonment of the Grayson family marked the end of one of the most horrific criminal enterprises in American frontier history. But the impact of their crimes extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families. The case fundamentally changed how travelers approached offers of help from strangers and led to increased military patrols along major travel routes. Religious communities throughout the frontier territories were forced to confront the reality that their faith and charitable instincts could be exploited by predators who understood how to manipulate Christian charity for evil purposes. Many legitimate missionaries and religious workers found that their efforts to help travelers were met with suspicion and fear as people struggled to distinguish between genuine charitable work and potential criminal activity. The Graysons' crimes also exposed significant weaknesses in frontier law enforcement and communication systems. The family had been able to operate for more than a decade without detection, partly because there was no effective way for authorities in different territories to share information about suspicious activities or missing persons. The case led to improvements in interterritorial communication and the establishment of more systematic approaches to investigating missing persons reports. Catherine Patterson, the survivor whose testimony had been crucial to the prosecution, never fully recovered from her traumatic experience with the Grayson family. She spent the remainder of her life advocating for improved protection of travelers and working with law enforcement agencies to identify and investigate suspicious activities at remote religious sites. Her nephew Timothy, the young boy who had survived the family's attempted murder, grew to adulthood bearing psychological scars that affected his entire life. He never married, never had children of his own, and spent his adult years working as a frontier guide, helping other families avoid the dangers that had destroyed his own family. The physical locations where the Grayson had operated were abandoned and eventually destroyed by local communities that wanted to eliminate all traces of the horrible crimes that had been committed there. The Sacred Heart Chapel was burned to the ground in 1858, and the Mission of Divine Mercy was dismantled and its materials used for other construction projects. But the psychological impact of the Graysons' crimes lingered for generations. Families throughout the Western Territories told stories about the false missionaries who had murdered hundreds of innocent people, using these tales as warnings about the dangers of trusting strangers who offered help on isolated trails. The case also raised disturbing questions about the nature of evil and the capacity for ordinary people to commit extraordinary crimes. Father Murray, Sister Constance, and Brother Ezekiel had not been obviously deranged or visibly dangerous individuals. They had been intelligent, articulate people who had successfully posed as charitable Christians for more than a decade. Their ability to maintain their facade while systematically murdering innocent families challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature and the reliability of religious authority. The case demonstrated that evil could be methodical, organized, and sustained over long periods by people who appeared to be pillars of their communities. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the realization that the Grayson had genuinely believed that their actions were justified and had convinced themselves that they were performing a service by eliminating weak and diseased travelers, while redistributing their possessions to more deserving recipients. Their self-righteousness and lack of remorse suggested a form of moral corruption that was far more dangerous than simple greed or desperation. The legacy of the Grayson family murders serves as a reminder that the American frontier was shaped not just by the courage and determination of honest pioneers, but also by the predators who sought to exploit their vulnerability and trust. The 800 people who died at the hands of the false missionaries represent a dark chapter in the story of westward expansion, a chapter that reveals the full range of human capacity for both good and evil. Their story stands as a testament to the importance of vigilance, the dangers of blind trust, and the terrible price that innocent people can pay when evil disguises itself as righteousness. In the end, the Graysons' crimes remind us that the most dangerous predators are often those who understand exactly how to exploit our noblest instincts for their own malevolent purposes. Today, more than a century and a half after the Graysons met their justice, their story continues to haunt the collective memory of the American West. The families they destroyed, the trust they betrayed, and the lives they cut short serve as permanent reminders that evil can flourish anywhere. Human vulnerability and desperation create opportunities for exploitation. The courage of survivors like Catherine Patterson, who risked everything to expose the truth and seek justice for the dead, provides a counterpoint to the darkness of the Graysons' legacy. Her testimony not only brought the killers to justice, but also saved countless future lives by alerting authorities and the public to the dangers posed by predators who used religious authority to mask their criminal activities. In remembering the Grayson family's crimes, we honor not just the victims who died, but also the survivors who found the strength to fight back against evil and ensure that justice was finally served. Their story reminds us that even in humanity's darkest moments, there are always those who will stand up for truth and refuse to let evil triumph unchallenged. What do you think about this chilling tale from America's frontier past? Does it change how you view the romanticized stories of westward expansion? The Grayson family's systematic exploitation of Christian charity reveals the darkest aspects of human nature and the terrible price of misplaced trust. If this story has given you chills and made you think about the hidden dangers that lurked on the frontier trails, share it with someone who loves dark historical mysteries. Hit that like button to support content that brings these forgotten horrors to light, and subscribe so you never miss the disturbing truths that shaped America's past. The next time you hear stories about the brave pioneers who conquered the American West, remember that they also had to survive predators